Good afternoon and Shabbat Shalom and a meaningful and easy fast, I hope. I really feel that it's a real blessing for our congregation to have the opportunity for this time that we all wish we didn't need to use in this way. When we were here 1 year ago, if we had been told that the main theme of our words and our programming at all times would be the need to fight anti-Semitism in the public sphere, I don't think we could have imagined this time. And so I'm really grateful. I want to start even before talking about what's going on. Many of you, I understand, know Mark Sandler, some from many, many years ago, and some recently. But we're thrilled and privileged to have Mark here. Mark is a senior and experienced criminal lawyer who was senior counsel for B'nai B'rith League of Human Rights, fighting hate speech for many years. I'm not gonna give the full introduction because we want to spend our time talking about the work. And so before I do want to say Mark established the Alliance of Canadians Combating Anti-Semitism in coordination with our whole community structure this past year. Something like so many well-intentioned individuals in our community who've given so much time, expertise, and effort to fight for our community during a time when that's what's needed. So before we start, I have to start by saying, Mark, not only welcome, but for the incredible commitment that you've made this past year and what you've done for our community, thank you. We can't thank you enough. It's not a service. You can clap if you want. It's okay. For the sermon again later, don't clap. But for this, absolutely. But Mark, you have so many years of experience in the previous public environment in fighting anti-Semitism. This past year, you were moved to found this organization that's really kind of an umbrella organization for so many who are working against anti-Semitism. What can you tell us about your experience? What have you learned about the situation in our community that we should all know?
Well, first of all,
Is it on? Let's just
see.
On works better. There we go.
First of all, I'm delighted to be here, though, as you say, under better circumstances. Nonetheless, it's a topic that's near and dear to our hearts, so I'm happy to share some of the things that I've learned. I want to start by saying that we're facing a very different environment, as many of you know, than, for example, we faced in the 80s when I was fighting neo-Nazis and fighting white supremacists, because even in the worst of those times, the anti-Semitism wasn't normalized. In other words, the neo-Nazis that I dealt with, the white supremacists, were not regarded in the mainstream community as credible. Now we have the normalization of anti-Semitism, and one of the reasons why it has been normalized is that it is coming from a hijacked progressive left, of which I was a very proud member for so many years. But now the progressive left brings with it this patina of legitimacy, because anti-Semitism isn't being taught anymore by neo-Nazis in subterranean environments. It's being taught in our campuses, and it's being taught by people with diplomas and PhDs. It's being funded by foreign resources that pour money into campuses in Canada and the United States to change the narrative that's taking place on campuses and to fund post-colonial theory that make Jews white privileged. So the very big difference that I see from the days of fighting anti-Semitism in the 80s is this normalization. And at the root of it as well is Zionism has been demonized. So people are free to say in this normalized environment, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm anti-Zionist. And because Zionism has become a dirty word as part of this campaign, then it is again normalized. So one of the things that we'll talk about is how to deconstruct this idea that Zionism is evil. Because when you think about it, those people who say, I'm anti-Zionist, I'm not anti-Semitic, can easily be attacked for a very simple premise, because by saying all Zionists are evil, all Zionists are genocidal, all Zionists are racist, they are saying, for example, that 91% of the Jewish population in Canada who are Zionists are evil, are racist, are genocidal. And that's a message that I'll tell you a little bit more about. We have to send the way of the non-Jewish members of the community and those who engage in law enforcement community, because they just don't get it in many instances. And the last thing I'd say about our situation, Rabbi, is that this normalization has also taken place in part because of a Trump phenomenon. And I know there are people here that see the connection between Trump and Israel and see that he expounds these things in favor of Israel. I'm not going to get into politics. Trust me, I have enough trouble with Canadian political scene without dealing with the American political scene. But I will say this to you, and that is, regardless of your views of Trump, regardless of where you stand politically in the United States, he normalized the kind of discourse that is going on. In other words, he made it acceptable for people to say, our blood is being poisoned by migrants. He made it acceptable for those same neo-Nazis I talked about to express their views within mainstream media and on the internet. And that's an unfortunate byproduct of the phenomenon that we've seen. So you take all of those things, you take the continuing demonization of Zionism, you take the fact that this is being led by foreign money, and a combination of that foreign money with this pattern of legitimacy through faculty and teachers, and you've got an environment that poses an existential risk to our community and not merely in the state of Israel.
During this time, we in the community at large, we here very specifically at Temple Sinai, we've had a much closer relationship with Toronto Police Services during the past year. And while occasional mistakes get a lot of attention, they've been incredibly supportive of our community in general. However, sitting right here next to a bridge that was one of the main sites of a lot of this anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic activity, where people who are likely sitting in the congregation today were present there and heard hate speech uttered very clearly as part of these quote-unquote protests. Can you tell, do the police have the tools they need in order to respond, in order to make arrests, and why is it not happening more?
All right, as a lawyer, I'm going to take the opportunity to answer 4 questions, even though you've only posed 2. It's what we do.
Every Jew loves a bargain, it's okay.
So let's start with the first question. Do they have the tools to do it? Absolutely yes. And when I say they have the tools to do it, there are a range of criminal offenses that are available to address hate crimes. And they're not simply the conventional hate speech laws that everyone talks about, the willful promotion of hatred. There are a series of offenses that exist under our criminal code that could be used effectively to address hate crime. And I'm going to give you an example. We have an offense under the criminal code, and I won't get too technical about the law, but I'll make this point by way of illustration. It's called intimidation. And you know what it says? It actually says that you're trying to compel people to do something they don't have to do, or compel someone not to do something that they're entitled to do, and you block a roadway, tunnel, or bridge in order to facilitate that objective. It's the crime of intimidation. And do you know how many times I heard city officials, or I've heard police across the country, or I've heard members of the community say, why don't we have a law that addresses the blockages of roads? We have a law, it's called intimidation. And I checked, it's never been used in Toronto yet to address a protest, demonstration, or occupation. We have an offense of mischief, the interference with the lawful use and enjoyment of property by others, including you. Think about all of the instances in which activities that you've seen have interfered with the lawful use and enjoyment of property, whether public spaces or private spaces, by you. It's on the books. Do you know how many people have said to me, why don't we have a law against disguising yourself during a protest? We have 2 criminal offenses: wearing a disguise with the intent to commit a criminal offense, wearing a disguise during an unlawful assembly. So the answer to your first question is, we've got the tools. And we not only have the criminal law tools, but think about the fact that we do have a municipality. We do have bylaws in our municipality. Do you think you could walk down the street and set off a smoke bomb and not violate a municipal bylaw for the use of fireworks? Do you think you could walk down a street and use an amplified sound system and not be subject to a municipal noise bylaw? Do you think you can block a road temporarily and not be in violation of a municipal bylaw that says you can't temporarily block a road unless you get permission A, B, C? In Toronto, no permit is required to conduct any of the protests that you're seeing on our streets. And I asked the question at a recent Toronto Police Services Board, why not? Why not? Doesn't interfere with freedom of speech to regulate the where, the when, the how protest activities take place. So stop telling me that we don't have the tools to do this. The real question is, do we understand the tools, and do we have the will to use them? So that's the real issue for me. So do they understand the tools? Well, I have advocated for, and it's now starting to happen, a different kind of training for police. Because police are getting training, great training, from organizations like Simon Wiesenthal on what anti-Semitism means. But then they need the next piece. How do I take this and apply it to what I'm seeing happening on my streets? So that involves an outline of the offenses, and that also involves case scenarios. So I will now give police case scenarios and say, what would you do in a circumstance where someone is yelling from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free? And I'll answer that question for those who are curious in a moment. But the point is, you've got to make sure that they understand the tools that they have. And the third is the most problematic, because there has been timidity across the land about the use of the laws that actually do exist to address extremists. And I'm not suggesting every protester be arrested. The extremists, the ones that chant, Sinwar, Sinwar, we have bullets for you, the ones that chant not only from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free, which people give a benign explanation to, even though we know what it means, but they're then chanting in Arabic, from water to water, Palestine shall be Arab. Don't tell me that's not hate speech. Don't tell me that's not willful promotion of hatred. So we need the will to go after the extremists. And I'm beginning to see some movement. And you know why I'm beginning to see some movement? Not because all of a sudden people are more charitable towards the Jewish community and what we're going through. I'm beginning to see the movement because the theme that I and others are trying to advance is, this is about lawlessness. Whether you're Jewish, whether you're Catholic, whether you're Muslim, this is about lawlessness on our streets. And it's beginning to resonate because the extremists have overplayed their hand. They've overplayed their hand, for example, at the Grassy Narrows protests with the Toronto District School Board, because it wasn't just Jewish parents that said, Why are you conscripting our children to participate in an anti-Israel protest when we didn't consent to this? And why are you having us portray the role of occupiers in that environment? The non-Jewish parents are saying, we have no interest in what's going on in the Middle East. Why are you involving my kid in that activity? So when people start to see it's a lawfulness issue, then we're starting to see some movement. And that's the theme that I and others are presenting to the government. It's not counting votes to see how many Jewish votes there are and how many Muslim votes there are, which is being done. It's being done by our prime minister. It's being done at all levels of provincial government. It's being done at municipal level. We have to strike on the basis of our allies working together to talk about lawlessness and the lack of safety of all members of our community. So there's a four-answer to a two-question scenario.
Well, you talked about the danger of dealing with politics, so let me make things more dangerous for you in that regard. Because having mentioned those,
I don't care.
Of course not, I know.
I don't.
I've witnessed in the last year there's a contest going on to see who can create unanimity among the Jewish community. This contest is between Prime Minister Trudeau and Mayor Chow.
Right.
Who else? Because this congregation proudly represents people of all political stripes.
Right.
And nevertheless, the level of dissatisfaction, of anger at these two politicians, to me, is beyond my experience of all the years here. Staying for the moment municipal, because that's what you're talking about.
Right.
What level of influence does the mayor and other of the political class have in whether or not these that we might be able to move against these people who are spewing hatred toward our community?
Okay, well, the answer is this, that the police are supposed to have the unfettered discretion to decide whether charges should be laid in a particular situation. So theoretically, the attitudes of the mayor and the city council and those at that municipal government level should not figure terribly prominently in whether charges are laid. But the reality is that we have to provide political support for a robust law enforcement strategy that police are engaged in. Otherwise, we're hanging them out to dry because, remember, the budget comes from city council. Remember that there is civilian oversight at the Toronto Police Services Board. So what I have urged is two things. First of all, you do have to understand that the mayor can't direct an arrest. That's not the kind of things that you ask a mayor to do. But what you ask a mayor and city council to do is to create a zero tolerance for hatred policy, and that the policy is not merely in name, but is operationalized. They have lots of things at city council that talks about hatred, a strategy to combat hate. The city manager just came out with a plan. I just addressed it before the Toronto Police Services Board. The plan relies upon definitions of anti-Semitism that make no reference to Zionism, for example. So, Goonish helfen, as they say, when that's the plan. The plan talks about municipal bylaw cooperating with the Toronto Police Service. Great, but what are they doing? I've yet to see the use of municipal bylaws in order to enforce crackdowns on hate fests. So the answer to your question is that you really have to press city council, and people like Councillor Pasternak are doing precisely this. They're doing their best under difficult circumstances, but you've got to press them to develop and operationalize zero tolerance against hate, and that's difficult. I'm trying to do it at the Toronto Police Services Board level because they have no policy on dealing with protests, occupations, and demonstrations. They're required to have one in law. So I and others may have made submissions to them in saying, this was what your policy must now look like so that you are giving support to the police to getting tough on crime. So a robust policy is the starting point from the board, and a commitment to zero tolerance for hate is an important underpinning. So I hope that answered your question.
No, it definitely does. It's helpful to have this sort of broader sense, and that leads kind of to my next question, which is it's helpful to have certain key voices who aren't afraid to speak out. I mean, you mentioned James Pasternak and others as well. But individual voices are never enough. They tend to be over-identified with the community and then sidelined. So in this fight that we're in, that really, it's really not just in name that we're fighting lawlessness and zero tolerance for hate. That is, in fact, what we're fighting for, not just in name. Who are the more important and the more committed allies that we either have or that we should be working more to partner with?
Right. So I said earlier on how important the non-Jewish community is in this fight, and I see them beginning to get involved in this fight. I mean, some of them were there from the beginning, but many were not. And I'm going to talk about a campaign that we're going to be involved in a moment. But for me, they are the most important voices, because what I am hearing when I speak at the higher political levels is that there's this numbers game that's being played. How many ridings are influenced by Muslim votes as opposed to Jewish votes? And we've got to get away from that thinking. And the only way to get away from that thinking is that if governments at the municipal, federal, provincial level understand that that thinking will not sell if our non-Jewish allies are behind us. So in our alliance, for example, we have a Muslim organization, we have a Catholic organization, we have indigenous leadership, and I want to tell you about the indigenous leadership. We have Iranian representation. We're reaching out to every community that we can, the Ukrainian community. We're reaching out to our natural allies, but polling is showing that we still have over 70% of the Canadian population generally is concerned about the way anti-Semitism is flourishing. In other words, we do have allies. They are quiet allies, and they have to become vocal allies. So for me, the focus is reaching out to your non-Jewish allies, and it has to start with education. You know, I think it's great when we have conferences where Jews speak to Jews. It's great, it's self-fortifying. People feel good about hearing each other talk about their common experiences and what's going on to our lives. But you know what? What really counts is Jews speaking to non-Jews and educating them. So I'll start a conversation by saying, just as a matter of curiosity, what percentage of the Israeli population are Arabs? So the usual guess, what, 2, 3, 4%? 21%. 21%. Of the 21%, they're represented in Knesset, they're represented equally in the medical professions, in all of the professions. They're represented. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but the point is we start with education. The lights start to go on. When I see a Palestinian girl say to a reporter, without any challenge, that says, you know why they're going after us? Because the Jews, they're blonde and blue-eyed. I said, where the hell are you getting this from? You know, I mean, not appreciating, go back to Europe. Before you chastise them for saying go back to Europe, tell them about the 850,000 Jews who fled from Arab countries. Tell them about the extent to which Israel is a country of color. And the lights will go on for those who are prepared to listen. So the two things that we're trying to do in the Alliance, for example, we're about to announce a campaign. It's going to be led by many recipients of Orders of Canada, and other distinguished Canadians to send the message that we, Jews and non-Jews, will not be silent on what's going on campuses, what's going on the streets, what's going on at kindergarten to grade 12, which is a whole other issue, and giving them things to actually do. In other words, calls for action, which I can certainly discuss with you. So it's educating non-Jews, it's getting them involved in the campaign, and I believe that's going to make a big difference. I do.
So you mentioned, after this question, I'm lucky enough to get to ask a number of questions, but we're going to take questions that people may have as well in a moment, so you can get the juices flowing, if you will. But before that, obviously, one of our primary concerns is reality on campus. And so I wonder if you could just share a few words of things we're just not going to read, most likely on the top of our inboxes, about what's going on to try to protect Jewish students and Zionist students on campus.
Okay, so let's talk about this at two levels. First of all, I want to commend Hillel, Stand With Us, CJA. They mobilized in partnership with us and others to assist in having a rapid response, which was CJA's task force, to incidents that would occur on campus. So there was a definite strategy that did involve collaboration, which was very nice for me to see, because the reason I formed the alliance that we talked about that now has 40 community groups in it is because I felt that the Jewish community often operates in silos and is therefore ineffective in dealing with these issues. So we saw that collaboration. But that's fine. So we've got student ambassadors on campus. We have representatives from our major organizations on campus prepared to react to incidents. But now we have to deal with it at a systemic level. So how do you deal with it at a systemic level? Number one, you know how we dealt with Holocaust deniers, again, in the 80s, who were teaching our students? We had them dismissed. We had them fired. The jurisprudence actually supports the fact that they are creating a poisoned environment for students, even if they're not teaching it in class, but only out of class. So we have to get back to the existing jurisprudence that enables universities to acquire a little bit of guts and fire the toxic professors, not because they're pro-Palestinian, not because they're critical of Israel. Be critical of Israel to your heart's content, but you can't poison the environment through indoctrination, and we have to do a much better job at getting at that. Second of all, universities have codes of conduct. This is not permitted. Indoctrination on campuses is not permitted. Occupations on campuses is not permitted. Well, it's time to take action on your own codes of conduct, and we're starting to see it now for the same reason that I said before, because the extremists have overplayed their hands. The university administrations, in some instances, are fed up. So they've got the role to enforce their codes of conduct, and then the ministers of governments have an important role as well. So these universities have anti-racism policies. They're meaningless unless anti-racism is defined as a way that is consistent with academic freedom as it should be understood. The freedom to associate with Israeli educational institutions. That's academic freedom. That's what academic freedom is really all about. Research integrity, the ability to deal with researchers in Israel and around the world without the interposition of geopolitical views. Institutional neutrality. What business does the University of Windsor have in writing, as part of kind of a blackmail on the part of the occupiers, writing to the government of Canada saying what you should be saying about the Middle East conflict? It's the most violative of principles of institutional neutrality. Universities are there for critical thinking, not for indoctrination. not to be blackmailed into taking positions just because occupiers take them. So at the systemic level, we've got to get the ministers of upper education to be doing the right thing on these issues. So people on the street, people in the campuses doing the grassroots work, ambassadors, your children as ambassadors on campuses, together with these systemic changes that we have to see.
Great, so I want to take a couple of questions. We have about 15 more minutes. I'll tell you what's going to happen after that. But just a reminder, you've heard me do this before, in case anybody's forgotten. A question is 25 words or less with a question mark at the end. We're very lucky to have someone with great experience and wisdom, and we're here to hear him, not one another. So I want to just take questions. I'm going to start with one right here. Stand up, and if you would just share your question.
Hi, Mark. You're not getting this question tomorrow night.
Hi, Carol.
I was not present, but I was extremely intimidated by the mass service that was held downtown that shut off the main thoroughfares. I was also furious that nothing was done about it. Are we likely to see something like that again, or has something been put in place to prevent that?
So let's talk about mass protests. I have to be careful in what I say. I am the complainant on criminal cases that are currently under investigation, and all but one of my complaints relates to mass protests. I have some sympathy for the police in effecting the arrests immediately during the protests. I understand some of the dynamics around effecting an arrest when you're dealing with a mob and you've got more limited resources. But the police have to, and we've had these conversations, have to videotape every one of these planned protests. They have to analyze what is said at the protests, and they have to act quickly, because one of the issues that we have in Toronto and elsewhere is that we don't have deterrent effect against those kinds of demonstrations unless there's reasonably prompt action taken. So if the complaint takes a year and a half to process, that serves as no deterrent effect. And what we're seeing in Toronto, and I can tell you the names of the people because I know them all, they are emboldened by the fact that no action's been taken against them. So the answer is, I think you're going to see some changes taking place. It's a slow process for all the reasons I indicated to the rabbi, because you need the understanding, you need the political will, you need the training. I think you're going to start to see it happening. Not as fast as we'd like, but you're going to see it happening.
Okay, next question here. Stand up, please.
Can we talk about the mainstream media, what role it plays? I mean, except for the National Post and a couple of others,
Right.
Most mainstream media seems to be anti-Zionist and certainly anti-Semitic, and
So
obviously is the CBC is the best example of that, I would think.
So is the question, what can we do about that?
Yeah, what can we do about it? I mean, is there any role it
Just
plays?
helping.
What can
I'm
we
just
do?
helping.
Okay, I'm going to give you my view on it. I haven't watched the CBC for a year and a half. I will not. And it's not because I'm willfully blind. I know what's going on. But the bottom line is I'm not going to patronize an organization that is not prepared to address both sides of an issue. I'm not asking them to be pro-Israel, both sides of an issue. So what we see is, we see distortion of the facts, we see acceptance of Hamas statements as if they're gold without any critical analysis. We see Jew haters being interviewed without any critical questions on the part of the speakers. I just want balance, and we're not getting it. Now, I have to tell you, there was one study that suggested that the mainstream media bias is not really negatively impacting upon the views of people in the community. In other words, the people who are watching mainstream media aren't being affected as much as the Jewish community thinks they're being affected. The real challenge is social media, which I kind of pick up from where the rabbi left off, at the end of the service, for me, that's the challenge. The real challenge is getting at social media, because our biggest problem are young people, and they are only consuming social media. So if time permitted, another time I could tell you about a whole strategy around social media, but that is where we have to focus our attention. And for mainstream media, you know, I generally don't ask that my articles be placed in the National Post, not because the National Post isn't doing a wonderful job, because I'm preaching to the converted, right? And I don't know if I have time, Rabbi, but I can tell you a story about the Globe and Mail. I did an editorial in the Globe and Mail, and the point of the editorial was that the report that was done at TMU about those students that wrote that nasty anti-Semitic letter, a report was completely flawed that came out and exonerated the students. And I wrote a critical analysis of that. And the Globe and Mail editor called me up and said, "Don't you think you're being kind of harsh on Michael McDonald, who wrote the report?" I said, "Well, wait a minute, what do you mean?" "Well, don't you think you should give him the benefit of the doubt? Like, maybe reasonable people can differ as to whether the letter from the students was anti-Semitic." I said, "So you, as the editor-in-chief, are telling me that you'd like me to change the point of the editorial in order to get it into the Globe?" And he realized that's a bit of a problem, because then I would have submitted something to the National Post about how the Globe dealt with it. So my editorial was published, but that's what you encounter. 2 times I had editorials refused by the Globe and Mail because they weren't timely. The one timeliness one was when I wrote about the presidents of universities at Congress in the US and their despicable behavior the day after they engaged in the testimony at Congress. And the answer was, well, the timing isn't right for your article. What could be better timing? That's what you confront.
Okay, we're going to have more questions than we have time. I'm just acknowledging that, but because we have about 8 more minutes, and then last year we continued this discussion out in the garden, because there are things we have to set up in here. I'm willing to go out there. I can't volunteer, Mark, but if he has a little more time, we'll make our way out to the garden at 2:45. But next question.
Thanks for coming, Mark. Appreciate it. We've talked about campuses and what's going on campus, but another concern, and I don't know what you and your organization are doing about it, has to be the school boards for the younger kids, right? There's brainwashing that could happen there, and so what are you doing about that?
So some of our organizations include the Jewish Educators and Families Association, so JEFA, SOS, JAPOSA. The acronyms are long. If you go onto our website, which I won't forget my advertising message at the end, you'll see that they are trying to address them. This is a very big problem, particularly at the Toronto District School Board, because there is a culture there that has promoted anti-Palestinian racism as a component of their anti-racism policy. And the problem with it is, leave aside the fact that we don't talk about anti-Israeli racism, we don't talk about anti-Ukrainian racism. It's really not a racism subspecies. I'm not in favor of discrimination against anyone, but it really has nothing to do with racism. But more insidious is that those who are advancing anti-Palestinian racism in the school board system define it in a way that we are automatically anti-Palestinian racists because we are pro-Israel. So in an anti-racism policy, these people want anti-Palestinian racism basically to demonize us. So this is a real battle that's being fought. It's the APR battle that's being fought. And the Jewish community is not entirely united on how to fight it, because some people in the community say, let's wipe out diversity, equity, and inclusion because of its treatment of Jews as white privileged. Let's just get rid of it altogether. It's a cancer. And then there are others, including me, that say, I can work within an environment of inclusiveness, of diversity, equity, inclusion, as long as Jews are given a proper place within that environment. We are the most victimized community right now, both in hate crimes and in hate activity. What community should be more addressed in inclusion policies than the Jewish community? So I'd like to work with diversity, equity, inclusion in a positive way. Not everybody agrees, but it certainly has to be addressed.
That's for Sean, actually.
Thank you for your time. I guess my question is, what role does civil lawsuits take?
What role does?
Civil lawsuits, can we use that as a tool? Because I know from a business point
Great
of view,
question.
the best way to get their attention is you sue someone.
Great question. So it's no secret. What I'm about to tell you is no secret, even though it's largely been happening behind the scenes. And that is that when October 7th happened, we fell back on a traditional model for litigation that the Jewish community has employed. And that is a pro bono model, where lawyers volunteer their time to address litigation issues. And the lawyers who have done this should be completely commended for the work they do. But it's an unsustainable model long term. To suggest that lawyers should be involved in complex, difficult litigation in the public interest, leaving their practices or leaving aside their practices in order to do this for free is unsustainable. So I'm working with UJA and CJA and a number of organizations, and Lawfare is a member of our alliance as well, to try to create a community litigation fund in the multi-millions of dollars that can address public interest litigation in the Jewish community's interest in a way that it can be given all the resources it needs, that we can look at it nationwide to pick the very best cases. We'll have the very best lawyers deciding on what cases should go ahead, and they'll make sure that the very best lawyers are doing them. So a community litigation fund, for me, is the answer. You heard the rabbi near the end of the service talk about potential lawsuit against platforms that fail to live up to the contract that they have with you. Perfect subject matter of a potential community nationwide litigation fund.
I now get to spend Yom Kippur apologizing to all the people's questions I didn't take, so I'm sorry. We'll do our best. But I want to give you a chance, like you said, in a concluding way, and then I'm going to head out to the garden. I think Mark might to the just out front in Stacy's garden. Feel free to join us if you want to continue some conversation, at least for a little bit. It's not just about it's not about individuals in the community joining the alliance. The alliance is an umbrella group, mostly of organizations. What can we best do to partner with you? And is there anything, God forbid, hopeful that you might feel comfortable leaving with us?
Sure. So, first of all, thank you for that opportunity. I'm going to ask congregants who are here to do one thing. We'll start with one thing. And that is that if you subscribe to our newsletter, which is easy to do, you simply go to www.alcca.
Yeah. So this will be in our events newsletter this upcoming Thursday. We'll send it out. It probably was, but we'll send it out to everybody.
.ca. If you subscribe, just go on it, very easy to do. It's free. You subscribe to it. Once a week, we have a newsletter, and the newsletter does two things that I think you'll really like. The first is it does critical analysis of topics. It's not superficial. You know, we don't have a paragraph blurb that rants about somebody or something. It's detailed analysis. And the second thing that it does is it always includes a call to action. So it gives you something that you can do. And I always pick things that are pragmatic and are easy to do. So starting with the next edition, I hope you'll look at the calls to action, and if you follow those things, I think you can really contribute to the work that we do and the work as a community that we all want to do. And I'm very grateful, by the way, that Temple Sinai was one of the early houses of worship that joined our coalition, and the role that the Rabbi has taken, and Laura Schwartz, who's here, has taken as a volunteer, very active member of the congregation, is very, very much appreciated. So that's what I suggest as a call to action, as a way to decide what it is that you can do. And I think you're going to probably find that the first call to action is going to have to do with the University of Windsor. The next one may have to do with the special envoy on Islamophobia, but there'll be lots of interesting things for you to do. Trust me.
Okay. Well, thank you. And by the way, anybody who wants to come out to the garden and tell me they want to be part of a group of Temple Sinai members who help encourage other Temple Sinai members to take up these calls to action, please tell me that. Because we're stronger when we do things together. But Mark, we're stronger. You want to say one more thing?
Well, I was just going to say, the Rabbi asked me, can I leave you with something hopeful? And I am seeing some different attitudes on campus. One of our groups brought an injunction at Concordia University to prevent the student hate-monger groups from engaging in their days of rage at Concordia. The injunction was successful. McGill then brought its application for injunctive relief to prevent that kind of activity taking place, intimidating students on McGill. Citing our case in Concordia, the judge in McGill granted that injunction. We're trying to build a body of precedent, a body of jurisprudence where students will no longer, and many of them are not students, by the way, but student hate groups will no longer be allowed to intimidate students on campus. It'll come with consequences. It's slow, but I'm hopeful. And the last point that I'd leave you with, which is hopeful, is this, that how many of you have seen on these occupations that somebody stands up and says, you know, I'm here as a proud member of the indigenous community because we stand in unison with our Palestinian colleagues. Of course, these rallies have nothing to do with pro-Palestinian. They're anti-Israel, pro-Hamas. They're not advancing Palestinian causes, but leave that aside. They rely upon their indigenous status to make the case against Israel. So here's what's hopeful. We have indigenous leadership within our organization. And one of the things that was done by that indigenous leadership is Harry Laforme, the first indigenous appellate judge in Canada, went to the Mississaugas. And the Mississaugas, traditional land, is where I think 15 of the occupations took place on universities. And they wrote to each one of the universities, and you know what they said? This was the chief, the grand chief, and the band council. They said, you have an obligation to listen to us about how our traditional lands are used. And we are fed up in seeing our traditional lands being misused to attack Israel, to foment anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Cut it out. That's the voice